Today we're going to talk about culture shock, and I'm sure to some extent we have all experienced culture shock. Um, I wanted to frame this with we experience culture shock in many different ways, and we adapt to new cultures and new situations better in some situations and not as well in other situations. um, I've told you guys before that I came to the US at 15 years old, and my parents literally dropped me off at a boarding school, a Seventh-day Adventist academy, and left. In fact, they left me with the cash for me to go register. Um, and they were gone. And I saw them 2 months later when they were leaving, maybe a month later, when they were leaving the US to go back to Brazil. And then the next time I saw them was the following summer. And a letter back then took 6 weeks to arrive in Brazil. A good letter would take a month when it was, everything's going well. And, things were improving. By the time my parents moved to the US, which was 5 years later, a letter was taking 3 weeks to arrive, and there was no email, if you can imagine that. And so we would number our letters to go back and forth, and I would keep a draft of my letters so that I knew what they were answering. Our communication had to be very specific. When I had a health crisis, I had to call a friend of my dad's and set an appointment. And that evening, he went up to the school where my parents lived and conveyed the message that I needed to talk to my parents. And I called back the next day at a marked time. And my parents were there waiting to talk to me. Goodness, that phone call cost me $100. And I was a poor student, so it was a big deal. So culture shock, even within a country, you can have culture shock. So you travel, you grow up in a region, there's a certain culture of that region, you move to a new area, there's a totally new culture. And here's the mistake that we make. Within one country, we tend to think about ourselves as being the experts and not being concerned with the local culture. So here in the US, when I arrived, I lived in Virginia for 4 years of high school. Then I moved to Northern California, and I was there 5 years. Very, very different culture. The East Coast, Southern culture. My grandparents lived on the very southern border of Virginia. It was closer to go to North Carolina to go shopping, for example. And they lived up in the mountains with, you could almost say, hill people. But anyway, a small community, beautiful community, very tight-knit, very supportive of each other. Everybody knew each other. In Northern California, everything was free flow, everything was do as you please. I personally found people to be much more accepting of my multicultural background, and a very, very different vibe. From there, we moved to the Midwest. We came to Andrews University. My boyfriend at the time wanted to transfer to Andrews. And so I followed him. He is my husband of 29 years now. So I followed him out here, and we found the Midwestern culture to be very different. Again, a new culture, a new way of doing things. And we had to adapt. We had to learn new ways. And maybe stereotypical, but we found Michigan and Wisconsin, where my parents were, to be a lot more slower pace, more family oriented. People were warmer, friendlier, invited people over to each other's homes more. Different environment again. And then we lived in Maryland. Now, funny thing, oh, I skipped, we lived in Colorado. And Colorado is, again, a different culture. We thought Michigan was very family oriented. Colorado takes that to a new level. They're more outdoorsy, more natural. There's an acceptance of any belief system, any way of life. I have found Colorado to be the state where I felt the most accepted and the most open, least judged. And yet it's hard, it's hard to say that. It's hard because every environment is different. Okay, so then Maryland. I was not expecting, when I moved to Maryland, to go through culture shock. I was not expecting to feel like a foreigner in America. And yet the culture was very different. And here's the mistake that I made. When I moved to Maryland, I thought same as usual. And so when I moved to Maryland, I was not looking at what can I learn and how are people different here. I came to Maryland with my lens and with my viewpoint, and I struggled. It's the place where I struggled the most to adapt. And it's not Maryland's fault. It's my own. It's my own attitude of when I moved there and what my expectations were. So there you go. Virginia, California, Michigan, Colorado, and Maryland. I have lived in 5 states, and each state had its flavor, had its lifestyle, had its pros and cons, and outlook on life. And so when you are negotiating, when you are doing business in any culture, in any environment, take the time to learn what is appropriate in that environment. Now, having said that, let me share my screen and we will talk about culture shock. Okay, so culture shock is the trauma that we experience when we move into a culture different than our home culture. By the way, a side note, marriage is a culture shock. You are joining 2 cultures into one, and if you are not expecting that, you will go through a culture shock. My family does things this way. Your family does things this way. Who's right? And when we approach it from who is right and who is wrong, we will always lose. When we approach any cultural situation from what can I learn from this culture, and what are the pieces that I can adapt into my life from this culture, from the beauty of each of the cultures, you will have a completely different experience. Okay, so we arrive in a culture, and there's an excitement, there's an initial euphoria. Everything is new, you're expecting new, and it's just this incredible new experience, right? But then reality sets in, and we get tired of the new. We get tired of trying to understand. We get exhausted. And the honeymoon is over, and we go through crisis or disenchantment. And now the critic comes out. They do things wrong. I don't like this, and this is horrible, and why this? And you can hear the critic. And as long as we are in that stage, our stress level is extremely high. And it's a very difficult stage to be in. And then eventually we move into stage 3, adjustment, where we start practicing things one way or another. And then finally, we accept the new culture. We understand. We can differentiate my culture from your culture and act appropriately in the right situations. Unfortunately, when we travel for business, we may be going through all 4 of these stages simultaneously. And we don't have time to go from one stage to the other if we're arriving, going to a business, and negotiating immediately. So being prepared ahead of time will ensure a much higher level of success. So when, this cultural stress that we face when we live abroad or travel abroad comes from not understanding the environment, from new foods, from problems that we face with housing, different climate, different services, different communication. The key word being different. The more differences you find between your home culture and the new culture, the higher the level of stress. So having positive coping skills that can help you make those adjustments are very good. Also finding ways to divert yourself. So taking up a hobby, planning family events, sharing problems with friends and family members, changing your mental outlook, making sure that you get exercise, that you fill yourself spiritually, that you pray, that if you're into meditation, but you do these things to help cope with all of the changes. And then let's not forget that when we return to our home country, we will experience reentry shock. And I hope I remember to come back to that later. Okay, so 40% of business interactions and 40% of people who are traveling to another country fail in their ultimate goals. And the biggest reason we fail is that we don't take into account that culture shock. So what do we do to mitigate this? Can you imagine 40% of negotiations internationally fail? What that can do to the bottom line of a company. So here are aspects of culture shock that we go through. So first of all, cultural stress, right? So we experience high levels of stress because we're not understanding the culture, or we're so immersed in trying to learn a new culture that it's it's unnerving. It's a big change that you're going through all at once. We also feel social alienation. So we're not in with the culture. We are not, we're outsiders. So we may not experience the same levels of friendships. We may not know what to do for entertainment, etc. Another aspect of culture shock is the realization of poverty and wealth extremes, of social class distinctions. So if there are very big shifts in those areas, that can feel stressful. And then financial matters, how money is handled, how things happen, on and on. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about our family experience when we moved to Guinea, West Africa. Let me preface this by saying 7 years in Guinea were some of the best years of our lives and some of our best family memories. It's where we raised our children. There's just so much tied up in there, and there's aspects of that culture that we've adapted into our own family life, and so on. But let me talk to you a little bit about the changes, right? So let's see. I think I need to think in terms of age. So when we moved to Guinea, Rochelle, our oldest daughter, was 23 months old, and our son was 5 weeks old, 1 month, not even a month and a half old. And I had gone from full-time professor, assistant professor at Andrews, to full-time stay-at-home mom in a new culture. And all of that is big changes. So the big change from being a full-time professional to full-time mom, I was not ready for that. I went from having lived in Christian countries to living in a Muslim country, from a Western lifestyle to an African lifestyle, from a Western salary to a mission salary. Our salary, by the way, was $500 a month over there, and our rent was $250. So that left us $250 to live on, which was the normal salary of an upper professional. But it was a big change for us. And we also found out that that $250 salary was also supplemented in many other ways that we did not have access to. But so you can imagine all these changes, right? And so I was going through cultural stress. Even though I was fluent in French and the educated in Guinea speak French, the heart language, the language that everybody socialized in, was a language I didn't speak. And I was trying to learn that language. I felt socially alienated. I didn't know people. People were different. Our cultures were so different that there was a lot that I couldn't relate to. There was the poverty and wealth. We were viewed as wealthy, and people, the average laborer lived on $30 a month, $1 a day. And that was subsistence. That was awful poverty to live on $30. And yes, they knew it was poverty and they knew how bad it was. So anyway, so we had all these layers, right? So I decided I needed to try to make friends. And I started going and just knocking on gates because they have the walls around, knocking on a gate and introducing myself. They all knew me already. I was only a white woman around. Um, but anyway, introducing myself and telling them that I wanted to learn about culture, and I was hoping that at one point or another we could talk. One lady immediately asked me how food was going, and I was like, you know, I'm struggling. There's the variety of food that I'm used to seems to not be available. And she's like, well, let me take you to the market. And so we would go to the market. I would pay for the food, which was then learning about the prices, because if I showed up without knowing a price, they charged me a lot more. Um, so I learned about the prices, and then we would come back to her house and we would cook together, and I would take copious notes, and then I would go home and try to make those dishes. Um, so, you know, I started interacting. Marriage, Western marriage and African marriages and Muslim marriages are very different. Um, and so we discovered that the husband-wife relationships were very different. And it was frowned upon for me um, to be as forward with my husband. Let me explain what that is. So in the Fulani culture, um, a woman never says her husband's name. And because it's a polygamist country, you never say my husband, because that husband could belong to other women as well. And so you talk about the husband, okay? So the husband, and I could not say Marcel. In fact, I got so used to not saying Marcel that my friends in the US thought I was really weird when I would talk about the husband. Um, so you have these aspects, right, that you're adapting to. Um, a woman never lifts her eyes and looks a man in the eyes. Um, and so I had to learn that I talked to men, my husband included, if I was talking to my husband in public, that I needed to look down, that I didn't make eye contact with them. And if I did, it was a fleeting, very fast eye contact or kind of glancing at their face. I learned that when our youngest daughter was born, that it's the husband who names the child. He doesn't even need to inform the wife of what the child's name is going to be. And I learned that I had no standing with my in-laws. Anyway, so I learned to act respectfully towards my husband in public and live a normal American marriage inside my house. Okay, so that people would view us as a respectable couple in public. I adopted that culture in the public eye. Okay. But all of that took a lot of effort and a lot of stress to adapt to it. If an organization is sending people overseas and there's a high failure rate, there's certain things that they need to do to help the employees prepare. So provide cultural, language, self-awareness, training, help them understand what the amenities are going to be, give them really clear picture of what life is going to be like. Provide feedback, provide rewards for the employee who is surviving and thriving even overseas. Provide continued training and support. and train family members as well. The biggest reason that an overseas assignment fails is because of the family, because the family isn't able to adjust. And finally, I wanted to show this little example, the Johari window. Johari is Joe and Harry. It's the combination of two people's names who created this. But there's basically culturally and interpersonally, we have 4 windows. So one window is that public window. You know all those aspects about yourself, other people know it, it's public knowledge. It's what I show to you. Then there are things that I know about myself, but they're private, they're unknown to others, and I'm not going to share those until I know and trust you. Okay. But then there are other things, and especially when we go to other cultures, we don't know about ourselves, we're blind, and yet others see that in us. It happens inside your own culture as well, but in a cross-cultural environment, you are blind to a lot of behaviors and a lot of things that other people see, and you could have other people say, knowing that you're making mistakes, and if they don't have the relationship and the permission to talk to you about it, then it can be horrible. It can spell failure. And then there are areas that are unknown to yourself and unknown to others. You're simply not aware of them. No one's aware of them. And when two cultures meet and neither culture knows the other one well, there are a lot of things that fall into this window as well. So this gives you a little framework in understanding yourself and others, and it actually helps to start a conversation and open the possibility of someone becoming a cultural informant for you. In Guinea, we had a language helper, and he became one of our closest friends, if not our closest friend. And he taught my husband the language. He traveled, translated, spent, I would venture 12 to 16 hours a day with Marcel, 6 days a week. And he had seen a lot of culture and had a facility, even though he was not an educated man by Western standards, he had a keen ability to look at our blind spots and to identify where things were going well and where we needed to improve. So, beautiful relationship that we established with him. I wanted to come back to the reentry shock. So during the 7 years in Africa, we returned to the US 2 times. And each of those times, you're traveling, you're visiting family, et cetera, et cetera. When we moved back to the US, our children were now 5, 7, and 9 years old. And they were completely, not completely, because we lived a mixture of American and Guinean culture inside our home. But there was a lot about American life that they didn't understand. So my life in helping everyone re-enter into the US became a monologue. We would be out on the street and I would be in a constant stream of consciousness talking explaining signs, explaining crosswalks, red light, green light. They'd never seen that before. Um, Explaining why we didn't have electricity all the time in Guinea, and now we did. In sink aerators, you know, the thing that grinds stuff up in the sink. They'd never seen that. They had to be educated on, you don't put stuff down in there. So fascinating, right, to educate your children on your own culture. And then learning to sort through what we liked and what we didn't, and what we were going to keep and what we were going to adopt back from America. And so re-entry into the US was a challenge. Now the fact that I was a stay-at-home mom and homeschooling my children was financially very, very difficult. And there was the social pressure to put the children in school, and my oldest child was not a good homeschooler. She would beg to go to the mall so that she could actually see people. So eventually we ended up putting her in school, and giving up on the whole homeschooling thing. So anyway, this Johari window has actually helped me be a lot more aware in cultural studies. So I thought you might enjoy seeing that. So again, culture shock or cultural adaptation is a fascinating area, and something that we should all be aware that no matter what the new location is or new situation that we go through some sort of or level of shock. And surprisingly enough, a lot of the shock that we go through is cultural changes. I hope you gain something from that, and that you've been able to see that in a new light. And when you're writing your paper or working on your website, that culture shock is something that will play into your discussion.